All right, welcome to the first topic of Unit 3 about Congress, our legislative branch. Today's topic is 3.1, what Congress does and how. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to describe the powers of Congress and how it uses them. As always, you should be following along with the fill-in-the-blank notes that are provided to you on the Google Classroom for this assignment. Before we can talk about what Congress does, we have to answer the first key question. What exactly is Congress in the first place? Simply put, Congress is the legislative branch of our national government. They have the power to legislate, that is, to make laws that we all have to follow. The Constitution sets Congress up as bicameral. That means it has two parts. Sometimes we call them chambers, sometimes we call them houses. So Congress is literally made up of a House of Representatives and a Senate. Each is called a chamber or a House of Congress. Now, U.S. history gets into why we set it up this way. It has something to do with a compromise between the larger population states and the smaller population states when we first created our Constitution, but we're not really going to get into that in this class. So the lower chamber, or lower house, is known as the House of Representatives. I'm just going to refer to it as the House. It has 435 elected voting members. Each state is divided into individual congressional districts. So there are 435 congressional districts across the United States. They're divided up into the different states, with each state having a different number of congressional districts depending on the population. So California, for instance, has 52 congressional districts because they have such a large population, whereas Wisconsin only has 8 congressional districts because we have a much smaller population than the state of California. So California has 52 congressional districts because they have the largest population in the country. So some of these districts are geographically very large. Some are very, very tiny. See, each of these tiny little colors represents a different congressional district. That's because there's so many people packed into these small areas. Each district within the state has to have roughly the same number of people living in them. However, a congressional district in California is going to have a lot more people in it than the single congressional district in Wyoming, because there's just so few people living in Wyoming, and each state is guaranteed at least one congressional district. The key thing to remember here is the larger the population, the more people living in the state, the more congressional districts they get, and the more votes they get in the House of Representatives, because each district elects a representative in the House to represent just the people who live in the individual congressional district. Their job is to reflect the concerns and needs of the people who live within the boundaries of that congressional district. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that there are 435 voting members of the House of Representatives, or the House, but there are 6 additional non-voting elected members. These people represent areas that are not part of a state, but are part of the United States. So, for instance, Washington, D.C., our nation's capital, is not part of any state, but they get to elect someone to go to Congress to represent them in the House. They just aren't allowed to vote on any of the bills. Puerto Rico, American Samoa, Guam, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and the Northern Mariana Islands also get to elect someone that goes to the House of Representatives to speak on their behalf, but they don't have voting power because only the states get to send elected representatives to vote in the House. If Puerto Rico becomes the 51st state, then their non-voting member of the House would be allowed to vote on bills. But until then, they can only speak on behalf of their constituents who live in Puerto Rico. The same goes for the Northern Mariana Islands, Guam, as well as Washington, D.C., American Samoa, and the other territories of the United States. Now, the Constitution only has 3 requirements for being a member of the House. First off, you must be at least 25 years old. You also have to have been a U.S. citizen for at least 7 years, and finally, you have to live in the district that you want to represent. If you meet these 3 qualifications and you can get the majority of people in that district to vote for you, you can represent them in the House. However, these jobs in the House have the shortest term of all the elected offices in the federal government. They have to be reelected every 2 years. Currently, if you live in Cudahy, you're represented by Representative Bryan Stiles, who is a Republican who represents this area in the House of Representatives. If you live in the boundaries of the city of Milwaukee and just north of it, you're most likely represented by this woman, Gwen Moore, who is a Democrat. Both just won their re-election in the 2024 campaign. On to the Senate side. Now, the Senate is made up of 100 members, unlike the House, who has 435 members. In addition to the 100 elected senators, there is also the Vice President of the United States, who serves as the President of the Senate. In the House, each representative only represents the people who live within their specific congressional district. The Senate's a little different, is that each state gets to elect 2 senators, and their job is to represent everyone that lives in their state. So that's everyone in every congressional district in their state is represented in the Senate by a senator. Currently, Wisconsin Republican Ron Johnson and Democrat Tammy Baldwin represent Wisconsin in the U.S. Senate. J.D. Vance, the Vice President of the United States, serves as the President of the Senate. We'll talk more about what the President of the Senate does in our next lesson. For now, just know the President of the Senate is the Vice President of the United States, and that they only get to vote if there's a tie. Now, senators in general have more power than members of the House, but we'll get there in a little bit. Constitutionally, there are only 3 requirements for serving as a senator as long as you've been elected. First off, you have to be at least 30 years old, you have to have been a citizen for 9 years, and you have to live in the state you want to represent. Other than that, those are the only constitutional requirements to serve in the U.S. Senate. Unlike the House of Representatives, where the entire House is up for re-election every 2 years, in the Senate, only 1/3 of the members are up for re-election every 6 years. So theoretically, every 2 years, you can replace every single representative in the House, but you'd only be able to replace 1/3 of the senators in the Senate. The other 2/3 would be reelected on a different cycle. But again, every senator serves for 6 years before they get reelected. Most of the work in Congress gets done in what we call a committee, and that's just a small subgroup of a chamber that focuses on specific issues. So, for instance, there is a Ways and Means Committee, and they take care of all the bills that have to do with Social Security, trade, spending, things like that, but they don't have to worry about any of the bills that have to do with agriculture, that is, farming. Other examples of committees are the Armed Services Committee, which focuses on the military, Education and the Workforce, that's pretty self-explanatory, Science, Space, and Technology, and so on and so forth. The idea here is that by allowing members of Congress to specialize in topics they care about or are interested in, it makes it easier for them to write laws and lets them become better experts about specific topics so that the bills will be better. Alright, now that we have a basic idea of what Congress is, let's take a look at what they do and why it's so important. So as mentioned, Congress has the legislative power, the power to make laws. But that's not the only thing they do. They also have what's called non-legislative power. These are things they can do that are not directly related to making law. One of these most important powers is known as the oversight power. The oversight power is held by both the House and the Senate, and this is their ability to investigate the actions of the president and his executive branch, as well as the judicial branch. They use this power by subpoenaing members of the executive branch and others to testify about a topic in front of the congressional committee. In essence, requiring members of the president's cabinet or his advisors to testify to Congress and let them know exactly what the president is doing with their power. This way they can keep an eye on the president and make sure that there's no abuse of power, corruption, or violations of the Constitution happening in the executive branch. A subpoena is just a legal document that forces you to do something or face possible prison time. So for instance, Steve Bannon here was an advisor of President Trump. He was called before Congress with a subpoena, and they demanded that he tell them what President Trump knew and what he was planning before the January 6th insurrection. Steve Bannon refused to go to Congress and testify, and he was then put on trial and found guilty of violating a subpoena issued by Congress and was sentenced to several months in prison. If in the process of using their oversight power, Congress discovers the president or members of the executive branch were doing something illegal or very, very wrong, then they have the impeachment power. This is the power that only the House of Representatives has. So the House will impeach, right? And this means basically they're formally accusing a judge or a member of the executive branch of a very serious crime. This does not mean that the president, member of the executive branch, or a judge is guilty of that crime. It just means that the House of Representatives did their research, used their oversight power, and they believe there's enough evidence to accuse them of having done something serious. Famously, President Trump, during his first term, has been the only president to have been impeached twice. Before him, President Bill Clinton in the 90s was impeached. Richard Nixon was almost impeached in the 1970s, but he quit before the House could vote to impeach. And before that, well, there really wasn't an impeachment before that, unless you go back to the 1800s. Once the House has voted to impeach, then it goes to trial in the Senate, and the Senate gets their removal power. So the House impeaches, that is, accuses a member of the executive branch or judicial branch of doing something seriously wrong, and then they're put on trial in the Senate. The Senate acts as the jury, and the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court acts as the judge for the case. The House of Representatives will pick a couple members to act as the prosecuting attorneys to make the case to the Senate to get them to vote to remove the president or other member of the executive or judicial branch from power. If the supermajority, that is 2/3 of the Senate, votes to convict, then that person will be removed from office and no longer be allowed to use federal power. Another non-legislative power held by Congress, in this case again only specifically by the Senate, is the power to ratify any treaties made by the president. So while the president gets to negotiate treaties with other countries, the Senate has to say yes or no to those treaties. It's like making a promise to a friend, but then going home and having to ask your mom for permission to keep the promise. So in that situation, you would be the president and your mom would be the Senate. Similarly, the Senate also has the confirmation power. This is the power to approve or reject presidential appointments, including federal judges. So while the president can pick whoever he wants to serve as a judge in the federal courts, or to lead the various executive departments, which we'll talk about next unit, he has to pick people who will be approved by the Senate. It's like offering someone a job, but then have to go back home and check with your mom to make sure you can give them the job. In this case, again, you're the president offering someone a job, and your mom is the Senate actually giving the approval. Okay, we've talked about what Congress can do, but let's talk about why Congress has the power to do these things. As far as why do we give Congress legislative power in the first place, well, that depends on your view of why we need government. We covered this in topic 1.1. So Congress has legislative power to keep us from tearing each other apart or to help us work together. It really does depend on your view of human nature. Now, the Founding Fathers, the people who wrote our Constitution, they believe the power to write laws was the biggest threat to our natural rights. Hopefully you remember that natural rights are our right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, according to Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence. Remember, the power to write a law is the power to create a rule that can take our life, our liberty, and our pursuit of happiness from us. Also remember that the purpose of our government is to protect those natural rights in the first place. That's why we have our government. So because the power to make laws is so dangerous, the founders decided to have the House and the Senate share that power so that no one person or one group can unilaterally make whatever laws they want. There has to be a broader agreement between a larger group of people to ensure that it's not going to be so abusive. At least that was the idea of how it's supposed to work. Today, there are 535 voting members of Congress, 435 in the House and 100 in the Senate. So collectively, they share the power to make laws. The theory is by having so many people vote on whether or not a bill should become a law, you're going to have to convince a large group of people with a wide variety of backgrounds that a bill is actually not going to hurt people's rights and actually will help people before it will become passed. This is why it's so important to have a diverse membership in both chambers to best protect the rights of everyone. After all, in the early days of our country, all members of the House and the Senate were wealthy, land-owning white men, and they tended to vote for laws that allowed slavery because that was in their interest. Now, the Founding Fathers were also afraid of the power of the executive and judicial branches, so they created what they called checks and balances to keep the other branches in line. This is why we gave Congress the oversight power to keep an eye on the other branches in case they threaten our natural rights. This is also why they gave the House the power of impeachment and the Senate the removal power. It's a way of holding the other branches accountable and stopping them if they threaten our natural rights. The ratification power stops the president from making bad deals or deals that will only help the president and their friends. After all, they have to get approval from the Senate before any treaty can be put into place. Same thing goes for the confirmation power. It stops the president from giving important jobs to unqualified people or people who would abuse their power. The idea here is that the Senate would put the needs of the country above loyalty to a president, so even if they come from the same political party, if the president decides to try to give an important job to someone who is not qualified, the Senate should theoretically use their confirmation power and stop that from happening for the benefit of the whole country. Okay, we talked about what powers Congress has and what Congress is. Are there any limits to what Congress can do? That's a great question. You'll remember one of the values of our country is limited government. This means Congress can only make laws about what the Constitution says it can make laws about. You'll remember those are called the enumerated, delegated, and expressed powers. For example, the Constitution explicitly says that Congress has the power to create an army and a navy and a post office. The Commerce Clause gives Congress the authority to make laws about things that travel from one state to another state, and the Taxing Clause gives Congress the power to make and collect taxes. The Naturalization Clause allows Congress to make laws about how to become a citizen. The War Clause gives Congress the exclusive power to declare war on another country. The Copyright Clause gives Congress the power to grant individuals the exclusive right to control and use their creative work. This is why you can't sell t-shirts with Mickey Mouse on it without the approval of Disney, because they own the copyright for that, and the copyright was issued by Congress. And the reason Congress was able to give Disney the exclusive right to sell images of Mickey Mouse is because the copyright clause in the Constitution says they can. The Constitution also explicitly forbids Congress from making certain types of laws. For instance, the Due Process Clause says the government can't punish you unless it first goes through very specific steps, like putting you on trial, giving you a lawyer, letting you present evidence to show you're innocent, things like that. We'll talk more about this in a coming unit. The Equal Protection Clause forbids the government from treating people differently based on their race. The Establishment Clause forbids the government from treating religions differently. And the Free Exercise Clause forbids the government from punishing you for your religious beliefs. Now, the Constitution does give a loophole that gives Congress the ability to grant more powers to itself that aren't explicitly written into the Constitution. This is through what we call the Necessary and Proper Clause, sometimes referred to as the Elastic Clause, because it allows Congress to stretch the powers that are expressed in the Constitution. Again, this is a way for Congress to stretch its powers and do things that are not listed in the Constitution. There are limits to this, of course. For instance, the power has to be connected to one of the expressed enumerated or delegated powers in the Constitution. Making the law must also be necessary in order to use one of the powers that are listed in the Constitution, and a proper use of government power. This means the stretch of government power must be reasonable. It can't be extraordinary. A reasonable person has to look at it and go, yeah, okay, that makes sense. A great example of this is that the Constitution does not grant Congress the power to create an Air Force or a Space Force. And yet, Congress did create an Air Force after World War II, and in the last Trump administration, created a new branch of the military known as the Space Force. That is because the Constitution says that the government was created to provide for the common defense of our country. It also has explicit clauses that allow Congress to create an army and a navy. So, would a reasonable person look at the Air Force and the Space Force, look at this and go, yeah, that's a reasonable way to go about providing for the common defense of our country? And if the answer is yes, well, that means the Constitution, through the Necessary and Proper Clause, allows Congress to create these new military branches. And this is because new technology has led to new threats, requiring new branches of the military to protect us from those threats and provide for the common defense. Therefore, using the Army and Navy and defense powers, it's necessary and proper to create the Air Force and the Space Force. We call these powers that are not enumerated in the Constitution, but that Congress can still use, the implied powers. Essentially, it doesn't say it straight out, but it's implied that you can do it. Alright, as always, take a couple minutes here at the bottom of your note sheet, rewrite today's goal, either by going to the beginning of the video and take a look at that first scene, or scroll to the top of your note sheet, see what the goal says, and rewrite it there in part A. Then identify 3 important facts from the notes that show that you understand today's goal, and finally, as always, write at least one question you still have that can help you better understand today's goal. Alright, have a great night, and I'll see you in class next time we're together.